Everyone, thank you for joining me for this lecture. We're going to be covering a brief history of the French school because it covers, 223 years. If we're looking at specifically the time where the Fencing Masters Corporation in Paris gets a royal charter up to its demise in 1789 for obvious reasons, when the revolutions began in France. So it has to be a brief history or we'll be here for weeks. So to not be here for weeks, we're going to abbreviate a good number of things. So when we talk about the French school, we tend to talk about it in a monolithic sense. And that being because France was able to have a strong transition of power from, one monarch to the next. And because of that stability, it allows for corporations to be formed, especially with the Fencing Masters of Paris. And that corporation is able to renew its charter, right, from one monarch to the next for 223 years. And because of that, the corporation of masters and the suburbs, right, they are able to establish a monopoly on defining what is fencing and who may teach it, which allows for them to codify, their views of fencing. Now, before we actually delve deeply into the specific history of the Corporation of Masters in Paris, I want to make a few notes about fencing being taught in Paris before the corporation is founded in 1567. I just want to make a few anecdotes about that. So we have tax records in particular from 1292, so the end of the 13th century, when Philip le Bel is king. We have tax documents with names, addresses of fencing masters who are teaching in Paris and how much they owe in taxes. So taxes are eternal. And so clearly, right, there are fencing masters that exist teaching fencing, long before there is a corporation of fencing masters, right? And even in 1554, there is an edict passed. The professors at the University of Paris find it troubling that the students are skipping class and ignoring the study of ancient languages to then go off into the suburbs to learn to fence. And so they are clearly missing a lot of class throughout the course of a day because they have to travel all the way out into the suburbs where the fencing schools are. And because of this, an edict is passed where fencing masters are required to teach in the borders of Paris to prevent students from disappearing all day and not returning from fencing class. So that is happening in 1554, and I find that very interesting, in so much as where around the same time frame in England, right, they sort of push the fencing schools out to the suburbs, they feel that the study of fencing, or at least the people at that time teaching fencing, they don't feel it is as respectable. So in England, they're pushing the instructors of fencing out to the suburbs, and in Paris, they're bringing them into the city. kind of shows you the very opposite mindset in the process. Now, in understanding this process of the history of fencing, it's going to be very important to look at the weapon itself, right? The sword of particular centuries and the practice tool for that sword over several centuries, because the weapon itself has a lot to say about what is happening with what they are teaching with the use of the weapon. So with that, in just a moment, I'm going to share my screen, and I have some great images to share with everyone as we go through this. All right, here in just a moment. Here we go. So you shall begin the brief history of the French school. And a lot of this information, if you're curious, a lot of this information, especially when I talk about specific anecdotes, they come from two sources, especially for a lot of this earlier stuff. One is the Bibliography of Ancient and Modern Fencing by Arsène Vigeon in 1882. Also the Maître d'Armes du Paris by Henri d'Arissy, who writes only a few years later. And I shouldn't ignore Louis Rondel. Like some of the anecdotes I just gave were directly from his book, but Rondel is pretty much just paraphrasing what these two authors say in their histories. The only additional information that Rondel includes is later on when we get to the late 19th century, when he's talking about the military academy of Janville-le-Pont, because he was one of the masters that comes from that academy. Other than that, he pretty just mimics what Vigeon and d'Arissy have to say. And one last side note about Vigeon and d'Arissy, they come from a line of families that have multiple fencing masters in them throughout the generations. So they are well connected in the fencing world. So the épée du sol, right? The idea of the weapon changes from the 1500s to the 1600s, and moving up to the 1800s. So the image we're looking at here, if I recall correctly, this was taken in the Bargello, and this is the hilt construction, and you can see just a little bit of the blade there. This is a fencing foil from the late 1500s, and this was certainly commonplace for the Italians going through the 1600s also, where the foil, or flore, Italian fioretto, the Spanish referred to a practice sword as espada negra or espada negra, and because you don't practice with sharp weapons. Obviously, there are issues with that particular line of thinking. So the thing here is that the practice weapon, or the foil itself, the hilt construction matches exactly the type of weapons that were commonly worn. It's just the blade construction is different than the actual sword blades that were worn. The blade you see here at the ricasso the part just inside the hilt, right? It has it's very flared, and then it tapers a great deal once it comes out. And the blade is quadrangular in shape and becomes more narrow toward toward the button, which it is a nail head that during the 1500s was often covered in a large amount of leather. And in my next picture, you can see here in the upper left, you can see the rest of the blade of that particular weapon, and you can just make out the nail head on the end. But you can see it looks just like a much wider foil blade than the ones that we are commonly used to when practicing foil. To the right, yeah, this is another practice weapon from the late 1500s. This is in my own personal collection. But you can see while the hilt is slightly different, the construction of the blade is exactly the same with the flared ricasso, and then it tapers, right? Once it comes out of the hilt, and it go, and this one, same thing. It goes all the way to the end with a nail head. And you can see here, I put a leather button over the end. So the practice weapons mimicked the weapon that you wore in the hilt, but the blade was slightly different to allow the safe practice of fencing. Now, the word foil, right, as far as in English dictionaries, I've been able to easily trace it back to the late 1500s, where Florio releases a dictionary, and in it he has the word foil, and it describes, a practice rapier, right, to be used in the practice of fencing. So the word foil has been around at least since the mid 16th century. I imagine sooner. Looking at various languages. So the idea of a practice tool, and even the word foil, is nothing new. Now, when we jump up to by the mid 1600s, looking specifically at France, because the Italians, their idea of the weapon isn't really changing that much. However, the French, their idea of the sword itself begins to change some, and what the fencing masters from the Royal Academies of Paris, they are now beginning to emphasize different things on how you hold, manipulate the weapon. And so while the weapon might be of a similar length to what the Italians are using at the time, right, in the early 1600s, as want to point out here, we have a very close-up image of one of the swords, and so some of the hallmarks of it, right? The blade itself, like similar to the Italian blades, they're either a diamond cross section or a hexagonal cross section. And one of the major differences from the Italian weapon or the two Italian weapons that we were looking at, you see it's no longer a swept hilt design with all the bars, interweaving. It now has a grand and petit coquille, right? A larger shell and a smaller shell. And so the weapon is becoming more simplified in design. Also, if I jump back for just a moment and look at the Italian weapon, right? During the 1500s and the 1600s, it was certainly common practice when using a weapon of this design to hold it. You see the crossbars here, the quillon, right? To wrap one or two fingers from the handle, right, around that perpendicular bar. One or two fingers could be wrapped around that to help you manipulate the points. And that was very common in the Italian school, to have at least one finger wrapped over the quillon. And then with the French by the mid 1600s, right? You see here on the left in particular that with the pas d'armes, or the arms of the hilts, right? They've become much smaller. And that sense of that ricasso where where your fingers would be supporting the blade through, that begins to be reduced. So it has a vestigial ricasso here. And this is one on the left is very decorative. So by the mid 1600s, certainly the French are advocating you no longer hold the weapon in a way where you are wrapping a finger around the quillon, but you are placing your fingers, like if you look at where the horseman is on the weapon on the left, you are resting your fingers on that flat, but you're not looping your finger. And this is clearly a new concept from what people are very used to. And because of that idea that you're changing a fundamental way people become used to holding the weapon, the training tool has to change. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner here, this is a foil from the mid-late 1600s. And you can see that they have the vestigial quillons there, and it has like this crown shape that is around the hilt. And what these bars do is they make it impossible for you to loop your finger around the quillon. You are now forced to hold the weapon, right? It encourages you very greatly to hold the weapon in a way that the French masters are now advocating. And this type of crown guard, you definitely see being well used through the end of the 1600s, because of the common grip that everyone was used to, and now the French masters are advocating something different. And so the practice tool has to change to encourage everyone to hold it differently. And in the bottom right, what we have are 102 and 101. Those are what we would consider early small swords that you're seeing the type being worn and used in the mid 16 to late 1600s. And then 100 is where by the 1700s, and certainly the mid 1700s, you see a transition. The sword changes, the blade style begins to change, and therefore how they practice fencing also begins to mutate to follow through with these ideas. All right, so jumping into the 1700s now, looking at what becomes of the French small sword. It reduces in length. The blade now goes from being a hexagonal or diamond cross section to a triangular cross section blade. And those of you who fence épée are familiar with those blades, you know very much what we're talking about, except the blades are a little bit wider than what we use today. And more specifically, certainly by the late 1700s, while the sword was always the training of the use of a sword was always the purview of the aristocracy, it definitely becomes a point of contention by the late 1700s. So here's some images. The one on the left is from a painting called a print titled "The Fencing Master" from 1685. And you notice the foil he's holding has that crown guard. And also of interest, he's wearing a plastron. And you can see that idea of the French guard with the left hand behind the head, the weight on the back hip. In the far right, we have an image from, the late 18th century. You have Henry Angelo in the foreground, fencing with the Chevalier Saint George. You have on the right, Domenico Angelo holding several foils and wearing a plastron also. What you can't see is in that same image because it's cropped. To the left, right behind San George, is a fellow who is having a fencing mask put on his face, a wire fencing mask, and it's being tied behind him. Now, on the very bottom, you can see by the 18th century, right, in France, that concept of not looping your finger, right, onto the blade of the weapon has become very commonplace. And so the foil itself changes. It no longer becomes necessary to keep that crown guard on there. And here you're looking at a lunette guard or a hollow figure 8, which acts as, the shell. Now, as we move into the 19th century, the foils, right, they are still the practice tool to learn to use fencing. But what is interesting, well, in France, the foils, it was traditional for the foils to have that lunette guard, that figure 8 shape, because it mimics that late small sword that, and even in some of the early ones, right, that figure 8 shape of guard. And that becomes very commonplace. And certainly by the mid and definitely the late 19th century, as you can see in this picture, you start seeing a much larger variety of shapes in the guards, right? Whether it's the hollow figure 8 or a solid figure 8, or if it's, an oval guard, or if it's round, or you even see the rectangular guard, which was designed by Maître. But the variety of guards really expands by the late 19th century. The blades themselves, certainly by the late 19th century, the foil blades aren't quite as wide. A lot of them become a little thinner, and you have you see a standardization of blade lengths, right? From smaller to larger and numbered from 0 in some cases to 6. Typically what we see is 1 to 4 now, or 5. If we're lucky, we can find those. The important thing about, certainly by the mid 19th century, is that foil becomes an art unto itself, whereas in all previous centuries, the use of the practice tool, right, was to train you to use the sharp sword, and they were used exactly the same. However, by early mid 19th century, you see a change in the way some masters are thinking about the foil, and the foil becomes an entity unto itself that is no longer a training tool specifically to use the sword of the day. And the sword of the day for the 19th century is the épée du combat, or épée. And we have a couple of examples here. In the bottom left, you have the épée du combat of the early 1800s, and you can see it. It has that same shape of the small sword. The blade is triangular, just like the late small swords, and it mimics it. It doesn't have the knuckle bar, which a number of small swords had, because by this point, right, wearing the sword was out of fashion. And so if you had swords, they were dueling swords. And so you had a match set. And from that figure eight shaped guard, right, it moves, as you're moving through from the mid 1800s on, it can be, a shallow dish guard, and that dish becomes larger and larger to help protect the hand. But the blade remains a triangular shaped blade that you see was used in France during the 18th century. All right, so that is a look at the transition of the weapon itself, but more specifically in the transition in the training tool of the sword during those centuries, leading with in the 18th century, 19th century, where the practice tool takes on a life unto itself that isn't specifically teaching you the use of the sharp sword, which leads to other issues that we will address as we delve into the history of all of this.